Thank you for your patience and welcome to the Oregon Humanities Center's 2005-2006 Criticos Lecture in the Humanities. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center, and I just want to tell you something briefly about this particular lectureship. The Criticos Professorship was created through a private endowment which, along with matching funds from the state of Oregon and the National Endowment for the Humanities, allows us to bring to Oregon each year distinguished scholars, critics, and leaders in the humanities who are known for speaking their minds. I can't imagine a more fitting Criticus professor. Excuse me, I'm sorry about that. Just take the mic? No, it's okay. Thank you for your help. I can't imagine a more fitting Criticus professor than tonight's speaker, John Shelby Spong, who has spoken his mind about his religious views for the last several decades and who shows no signs of letting up to the benefit of us all. As Bishop Spong mentions in the introduction to one of his books, Why Christianity Must Change or Die, in 1998, he has had a self-described truth squad shadow him in Australia, handing out materials designed to, as he puts it, mute his witness. He's lectured with guards protecting him in Calgary, Alberta. He's walked through shouting picket lines in San Diego before he tried to give a lecture there. I'm not trying to alarm you. He endured a bomb threat when speaking at the Catholic University in Brisbane, as well as, I think it's now up to 16 death threats. So I call John Shelby Spong Criticos Plus. Now, time for a commercial break. If you'd like to offer us feedback on this or other programs, if you'd like to be on our mailing list, please pick up a comment form from a member of our staff. And if you appreciate and enjoy the programs the Humanities Center offers, and you'd like our programs, which, as you know, are free and open to the public, to continue in the future, please think about making a gift to the center. And I should also mention that there will be a book sale and signing in the lobby of 150 Columbia following tonight's lecture. The commercial is now over. John Shelby Spong was Bishop of Newark, New Jersey for more than 20 years and is one of the leading spokespersons in the world for an open, scholarly, and progressive Christianity. He's the author, co-author, or editor of more than 20 books, including the best-selling Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism, and I've already mentioned Why Christianity Must Change or Die, a must-read. His most recent book is entitled The Sins of Scripture, Exposing the Bible's Texts of Hate to Reveal the God of Love, 2005. Now, we often hear God evoked by politicians and people in the media these days. American presidents, for example, feel compelled to remark after a major speech, or even a minor one, God bless America. It's hard to imagine the president of Luxembourg ending one of his speeches with the phrase, God bless Luxembourg. But what do these politicians, media personalities, and others mean when they utter the word God? Tonight, Bishop Spong will ask, who is the popular God in public life in the 20th century? Please join me in welcoming the Oregon Humanities Center's 2005-06 Criticos Professor, Bishop John Shelby Spong.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you all for being here. I'm absolutely delighted to be back in the lush and progressive and beautiful state of Oregon. I've been here a number of times before. I've had the privilege of lecturing at Portland State University, Lewis and Clark University, Willamette University. And now tonight I arrive for the first time at Oregon's Mecca, the University of Oregon. My closest connection with this university before tonight was that a member of my extended family actually is on the faculty here. His name was Garrett Epps, and he's both a lawyer and a novelist. And I'm pleased to be tonight at Joy Harrington's alma mater. My topic tonight, Steve said, was talk about the popular God in the 20th century. I'd like to talk about the popular God in the 21st century. I want to analyze and to critique the rise of popular religion. I want to look at it not only in America, but very briefly in the world. It's a world phenomena. And I want to contrast this popular religion with what I hope will be a different portrait of a God that I think we can meet in the very heart of the Judeo-Christian faith story. There are those who at least think that they see across the world today a great religious revival that they claim is carrying people back to God. I'd like to look at that revival for just a bit. This revival, they say, certainly has an American component. And they support that claim by pointing to these data. There is certainly in the United States today a rise in what would be called evangelical Christianity. It is also certainly a fact that evangelical Christians have joined forces with conservative Roman Catholics and with a very conservative Pope to create a political power base in this country that we call in the media the religious right. It is also not a secret that the current American administration actively courts this religious vote and articulates their point of view and identifies many policies with their agenda. Instances of this are opposition to stem cell research, speaking out in favor of intelligent design as an alternative to evolution, calling for a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage, appointing anti-abortion justices to the Supreme Court, flying from Crawford, Texas in the middle of the night to sign a bill rushed through Congress by Senator Bill Frist and Representative Tom DeLay to save the life, the biological life, of a woman named Terri Schiavo, and to save her life over her stated written intention, when she was able to state her intention, to save her life over her husband's objection, to save her life over her doctor's objections, and to save her life over the permission already granted by the courts of this country on several levels, and with the great majority of the judges who served on these courts having been appointed by Republican presidents. This surge of religious fervor does not seem to be limited to the United States. We have witnessed a rise in Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East. We see Jewish fundamentalism in Israel. Many people are not aware that a Reform or conservative rabbi cannot conduct a marriage in Israel. It has to be done by Orthodox fundamentalist Jewish rabbis. I guess that's a bit of a redundancy. I've never known a rabbi who wasn't Jewish. But you can also see this kind of fundamentalism on the boundary between India and Pakistan, where there is a Hindu fundamentalism that was recently in riots. And when the price of oil rises in the world, you see things like the Wall Street Journal adds a religion reporter to its reporting staff, because religion now has economic consequences. The question that I want to raise is, what kind of God is this who has become so politically powerful? What kind of God is fueling the religious revival? And how does this God compare with the God of historic Christianity? The popular God of today seems to have many things in common with what we would call a tribal deity. The marks of a tribal deity throughout history are easy to identify. A tribal god always has a chosen people. Now, the problem with God having a chosen people is that everybody who's not part of the chosen people becomes God's unchosen people. And it's a very short line between being God's unchosen and seeing yourself as God's rejected. And if you can convince yourself that God has rejected people who are your enemies, then it's very easy for you to reject your enemies. That's part of a tribal religion. A tribal God hates everybody the chosen people hate. That is why tribal religion so often takes on the quality of terror, the imposition of its will upon another people. And that is why people in the service of a tribal god think nothing about killing in the name of their god. And history is replete with instances of that, modern and long-time history. 9/11, I remind you, was motivated by God commanding Islamic fundamentalists to strike a blow against the demon nation of the West. And so Osama bin Laden directed his airplanes into the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon in the name of God. He was only doing what we had taught him to do through the ages. Go back and look at the history of Western civilization. Catholics and Protestants killed each other in a 30 years war, each trying to impose their understanding of God on the other. The Crusades were organized by the Vatican, and the primary result of the Crusades was the murder of Jews and Muslims in the Holy Land. In this country, we have witnessed pro-life people who engaged in murder at abortion clinics. It's really hard to imagine being pro-life and murdering in the cause of life. It doesn't quite go together. We see this kind of tribal mentality in the fact that there are high levels of religious support among people of this country for the Iraqi war. Without religious support, it probably wouldn't hold a majority, if indeed it holds a majority today. Throughout history, Christians have killed Jews. They have killed Muslims, always in the name of God. Our history is replete with this kind of tribal deity destruction, with the tribal deity perfuming human terror. And every religious system in the world has at least some of its roots in what I would call tribal religion. I think that one could argue that in the 20th century, the tribal religion of the Western world is the Judeo-Christian tradition. The tribal religion of the Middle Eastern part of the world is the Islamic tradition. And the tribal religion of what we call the Far East is basically Hinduism in combination with Hinduism's child, Buddhism. And if you look at our world, religious conflict is almost inevitable in those places where these various tribal religions confront one another. Hindu versus Muslim on the Indian-Pakistani boundary. Jews versus Muslims in the Middle East. Christian fundamentalists against Islamic fundamentalists throughout Africa. And then when you put into that mix an oil-thirsty, ostensibly Christian Western world, incurring the wrath of Islamic fundamentalists with things like its pro-Israel stance, its support of the Shah of Iran, its various wars upon Iraq, then you get the prescription for terror that grips our world today. Even within tribal religions, there is a tremendous clash of various parts of that tribal faith. If the Judeo-Christian tradition is the tribal religion of the Western world, then we need to be able to understand the result of our own anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is Christian hatred for the religious tradition that gave us birth. Anti-Semitism is Christian spitting upon our mother. Jesus was a Jew. Wonder why that's not part of our consciousness. One little girl confronted me in an airport in Tel Aviv, and I had a cross on, and it had some Hebrew writing in the cross. And she came up to me and she said, "Why do you have that Hebrew writing on your cross?" And I said, "That's my way of trying to remind myself and the world that Jesus was a Jew." And she said, "A Jew? I thought he was a Catholic." When I was a child growing up in a Sunday school in Charlotte, North Carolina, I never met a good Jew. They were always portrayed as evil, sinister, dark people. They had names like Judas Iscariot and Sadducees and Pharisees, and nobody ever told me that Jesus was a Jew. When I saw a picture of Jesus, he didn't look like a Jew. I thought he was a Swede. He had blonde hair and blue eyes, but I knew Judas Iscariot was a Jew. And every time the phrase "the Jews" appeared in my Sunday school literature, it meant something evil. The Jews were out to get Jesus. The Jews were out to get St. Paul. My Sunday school filled me with anti-Semitism. In our history, in the Western world, Christians blamed the Jews for the bubonic plague. Adolf Hitler blamed the Jews for the economic collapse of the Depression that brought Hitler into power. And he decided to even the score with these enemies by annihilating them in his crematoriums in what we now call, to our shame, the Holocaust. You can go back a little further and you will find that there was a great Spanish armada that set sail for England. Why? To conquer Protestant England for Catholic Spain. And when that armada hit bad weather and was destroyed, it was interpreted as a victory for the Protestant God over the Catholic God. That's tribal religion. How often we have taken our tribal prejudices and sanctified them with our religious language. But in some parts of the Bible, that's exactly what we have portrayed. And somehow we've surrounded the Bible with such an aura of holiness that it's very difficult to face those things. But read some of the biblical stories for what they are. Sometimes the God portrayed in the Bible is a bloodthirsty tribal deity. Look at the story of the Exodus. It's very clear that God hates Egyptians. God sends plague after plague after plague after plague on the Egyptians. And in the middle of those plagues, even the Pharaoh has had enough. So the Pharaoh comes to Moses and says, this is all in the Bible. The Pharaoh says, enough, Moses, call your God off. We'll let you go. And so Moses prepares for the Exodus. And then the Bible says, God hardened Pharaoh's heart so God could hit him again. Great vindictiveness. And you know what the final plague was? God was going to send God's angel of death throughout all the land of Egypt to kill, let me use the more emotional word, to murder every firstborn male in every Egyptian household. Didn't matter whether the firstborn male was good or bad. The firstborn male had to go. How many of you are firstborn males in your household? You need to read that story existentially. The conversation in the Bible is rather fascinating. Moses says to God, well, now, wait a minute, God, some of those houses have Jews in them. How are you going to keep this angel of death from killing Jews by mistake? And God says, oh, I've thought about that, Moses. So I tell you what I want you to do. I want you to instruct all Jewish families to get an extended family group so that nobody's left out. And I want you to slay the Paschal lamb. And I want you to put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost of Jewish homes. Because, God implies, my angel of death's not smart enough to know the difference between a Jewish home and an Egyptian home. So it's got to have a bloody signpost out there. And when you see the bloody signpost, the angel will pass over that house and only kill Egyptians. That's tribal religion. And it's in our biblical story. I could take you to the book of Joshua. Joshua's at war with the people of Ammon, called the Amorites. And Joshua is winning the war, and he's routing the Ammonites, but the sun begins to go down. And Joshua prays, and God stops the sun in the sky, creating the first instance of daylight saving time for the sole purpose of allowing Joshua to kill more of his enemies. That's not a very noble purpose for stopping the sun in its route. That text, interestingly enough, was the one used to condemn Galileo. Because if Joshua can cause the sun to stop in the sky, that was clear proof that the sun rotated around the earth. And so Galileo had to be right or wrong. It's interesting how we've used the Bible. And then most people think genocide is evil. But genocide is in the Bible. The prophet Samuel addresses King Saul and says, in the name of God, you are to go to war against the people of Amalek. They were called the Amalekites. And in this war, says the prophet of God, you are to kill every man, every woman, every child, every suckling, every ox, every ass. What's the definition of genocide? The Bible portrays Samuel, the prophet of God, calling on the Jewish people, the chosen people of God, to commit genocide in the name of God. It's not a surprise that people today can quote the Bible to justify almost any act of terror or any prejudice that they wish to engage in. The fact is that the adherents of tribal religion always quote the tribal passages of their sacred scriptures to justify their definitions, their prejudices, and their hatreds. And that's why religion is not an unmixed blessing in our world. Now I need to tell you that I grew up an evangelical fundamentalist in the heart of the Bible Belt. And in the church of my youth, an Episcopal evangelical fundamentalist church, the Bible was constantly quoted to preserve and to validate the ongoing cultural prejudices of my region. According to my church, segregation was the will of God, and they quoted the Bible to prove it. The subjugation of women into second-class citizenship was the will of God, and they quoted the Bible to prove it. Especially that text that says women should keep quiet in church. Or that text that says, I forbid a woman to have authority over a man. Is that text going to play with the co-ed graduates of this university? It doesn't play with my daughters. I have 4 daughters. You can't not be a feminist with 4 daughters. I told my counterpart, the Archbishop of Newark of the Roman Catholic Church, that the Roman Church would never get its head around the issue of women until its priests had daughters. And he told me how long it would take to have a cold day in you-know-where. One of my daughters is the managing director of a major American bank, the Sun Trust Company of Orlando. One of my daughters is a lawyer teaching in the law school at the University of Richmond. One of my daughters has a PhD in physics from Stanford and is in the high-tech industry. And one of my daughters is a captain in the United States Marine Corps who just returned from her 3rd tour of duty in Iraq. Now, you speak to daughters like that and say, but the Bible says, I forbid a woman to have authority over a man. And see how far you're going to get. The Bible is quoted to justify cultural prejudices. That's tribal religion. That kind of religion always emerges when fear rises. Look throughout the history of the United States. Every time we've had great upheaval in the social order of the United States, we've had a rise of fundamentalistic tribal religion. It's almost inevitable. Tribal religion is about personal security. It's about justifying your fears and projecting your hatreds. It always comes when survival is threatened. It always comes when change is greater than people can absorb. We seem to live in such a period of history. And we are witnessing a great revival of tribal religion. But let me focus on the content of that religion for just a moment. Have you ever tried to analyze what the appeal of tribal religion is to so many people? It obviously has appeal. There's one section of our country, the section of my birth, the section of my rearing, that is even called in the United States the Bible Belt. In that section, church-going is higher than it is in any other section of our nation. In that section, the Bible is read much more frequently than it is in any other part of our nation. And in that section, we have the basis of that group of people called the religious right in this country. So I think it's important that we look at what kind of Christianity the religious right produces. The judgment in the biblical story is that you know a tree by the fruit it produces. What kind of fruit is produced in the Bible Belt, in the religious right? Well, let us notice some facts of history. What we call the Bible Belt is almost identical with what we once called the Old Confederacy. And in the Old Confederacy, where they read the Bible regularly, where they went to church in enormous numbers, they also practiced slavery until a war forced them to give that evil practice up. It wasn't done voluntarily. Put those things together and ask how that's possible. What kind of Bible do they read in the Bible Belt? That they think slavery is part of the will of God. When slavery was finally done away with by force of arms, its bastard stepchild took its place, called segregation. And people lived in that segregated system, diminishing the humanity of people of color. What kind of Christianity is it that will treat human beings as subhuman creatures? It was in that same part of the country, the Bible Belt, and those of you who are history majors will certainly know this, that in 1876, when Rutherford B. Hayes ran for president against Bill Tilden of New York, Samuel Tilden of New York, it was a contested election, not unlike the election of 2000 in this country. And in this contested election, a deal was struck. And all the contested votes were in the South, mostly in South Carolina and Florida. History does have a way of repeating itself. And all of the contested votes were awarded to Rutherford B. Hayes, every single one of them. And he won the Electoral College by a single electoral vote. And the quid pro quo in that election was that the South would deliver these votes to the Republican candidate, and in exchange, he would withdraw the military presence from the South so that segregation could be reimposed upon the black citizens. That's the Bible Belt. That's the fruit of reading the Bible and going to church. What kind of Bible do they read in the Bible Belt? Do they only read those tribal portions? Well, it's also in the Bible Belt, my homeland. I'm not talking as a foreigner. In the Bible Belt, legal lynching occurred until the 1940s. They were never prosecuted. Civil rights workers were killed into the 1960s, and they were never prosecuted. The people of the Bible Belt set dogs upon black people in the Civil Rights March. The people in the Bible Belt used fire hoses on black people in the 1960s. And the courts and the judges refused to convict any of these people of their crimes. And they were all church-going, Bible-reading, born-again Christians. What kind of religion is this? What kind of Bible is it that they read? What kind of God is it that they worship? If the test is that you judge the value of a tree by the fruit that it produces, what do you do with this list of fruits of that kind of religion? One other thing that might be important to know. Do you know what part of the country has the highest divorce rate in America? It's the Bible Belt. Do you know what part of the country has the highest instances of spousal abuse and child abuse? It's the Bible Belt. Do you know what part of the country has the highest abortion rate? It's the Bible Belt. Do you know what part of the country commits adultery more than anybody else? It's the Bible Belt. Somebody said they commit adultery more in the South, they just don't enjoy it as much. On almost every one of these issues, the South leads the nation. What kind of God is worshipped in the Bible Belt? What kind of Bible is read in the Bible Belt? Do you know which two states in our nation buys the most pornographic material? Alabama's number one, the heart of the Bible Belt, and Utah is number two. What does that tell you? Do you know which part of the nation executes more convicts than the rest of the nation put together? It's the Bible Belt. It's indeed Texas alone. But if you put the rest of the Bible Belt together with Texas, they execute more people than every civilized nation in the world put together every year. What does this mean? What kind of religion is it? What kind of religious revival are we having? Do you know what section of our country supports the war in Iraq with the highest percentage? It's the Bible Belt. Where is hostility toward gay and lesbian people the deepest in America? It's in the Bible Belt. It's among those people who go to church most frequently, among those people who read the Bible most regularly, among the people who are the most overtly religious. Where's this conflict? How do you understand that kind of behavior? If this kind of religion represents the content of the rise of religion in the 21st century, is that progress? Does anyone want this kind of religion to be the content of a religious revival? Is that the direction you want to go yourself? Is that the direction you want your nation to go? Or your world to go? But even more important, Is that an accurate portrait of the God of the Bible? Well, it is the God that you will find on some pages of Holy Scripture. But the fascinating thing about the biblical God is that the biblical God seems to grow through the ages. No, I don't think it's fair to say that God grows, but it is fair to say that the human perception of who God is and what God means might grow through the ages. While parts of the Bible say that God hates Egyptians and murders the firstborn male in every Egyptian household, and that God hates Amorites, and that God hates Amalekites, and God hates anybody who's the enemy of the chosen people, there are other parts of the Bible that begin to stretch the human imagination to a universal God with a universal human family. Listen to the words of the great prophet Malachi, Jewish prophet of about the 4th century before the Common Era, who had a different vision from this tribal religion. He called people to a universal consciousness. Malachi said, "From the rising of the sun to its setting, God's name shall be great." Where? Among the Gentiles, among the unclean, the enemies of the Jewish people. "And in every nation incense shall be offered unto my name." That's Malachi, Jewish prophet, 4th century, before the Common Era. There are other places that give you a different sense of God. You could go to Matthew's Gospel, who portrays Jesus as saying, your responsibility, once you understand the meaning of my life, is to go into all the world. Go out there where people are different, where their languages are different, their looks are different, their skin is different, and their religion is different. And you are to preach the gospel. And we interpret that to mean you're supposed to go out there and convert those people. But that isn't what gospel meant. It meant you go tell the news of God's love for all that God has made. You go out among the strangers, the different, those you've called unclean, and you tell them about the love of God. And there's some parts of the Bible that present God in great vindictiveness and judgment, but there are other parts, like the 8th century prophet of the Jewish people, a man named Hosea, who tells us of a God who loves people no matter who they are, no matter what they do. Even Hosea's wife, who had become a prostitute, was still loved by Hosea. And Hosea understood that to be a symbol of the fact that God loves all of the people of this world, no matter what they do, no matter who they are. And that note is picked up in the book of Acts when Peter is quoted as saying, "Now I see that God shows no partiality, but in every nation those who do the work of righteousness are accepted by God." A very modern idea, not creedal behavior, not creedal beliefs, but those that do the works of righteousness, the works of humanity. The Epistle of John says that if you can't love, you never know God, for God is love, he says. If you want to abide in God, you must abide in love. That's a very different idea from killing all of the enemies of the tribal deity. And there are some parts of the Bible that exhort us to be righteous and to create lives more oriented toward proper worship and proper judgment and proper living. Righteous people can be very unloving people. But there are other parts of the book of the Bible, like the prophet Amos, again an 8th century Jewish prophet, who tells us that the worship of God is nothing but human justice being offered to God. And human justice is nothing but the worship of God being lived out among human beings. And you can never separate these two things. And if you do, you have become an idolater. If worship doesn't issue in your understanding and caring and love for other human beings. There's something wrong, and that's never the result of tribal religion. And then there was the prophet Micah, who confronted people who believed that what God really wanted was proper liturgy and proper worship and proper sacrifices. And Micah puts the people of Israel on trial in his 7th century book. And Micah asked them the question, what is it that the Lord requires of you? And then he answers his own question. It is to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Tribal religion identifies enemies, but the deepest strand of religion in the biblical story drives us to a place where we are told we must love our enemies. We must bless those who persecute you. And the only way you can finally be fully human is to love your enemies. That's not easy. But as long as you're busy hating, your own humanity is impaired. Now think about what that means for just a moment. You cannot worship God until you love your enemies. You cannot really be fully human until those people whose loved ones died in the World Trade Center can bring themselves to love Osama bin Laden. Think about that. You cannot really be human until those who lost their families in Hitler's Holocaust can bring themselves to love Adolf Hitler. Think about that. Jews will never be human until they learn to love Palestinians. And Palestinians will never be human until they learn to love Jews. And Catholics will never be human until they learn to love Protestants. And Protestants will never be human until they learn to love Catholics. And blacks will never be human until they love the Volcanos of the world and the Ku Klux Klan members and the David Dukes of the world. And the David Dukes and the Ku Klux Klan members will never be human until they learn to love blacks. And the Pope will never be human until he learns to love homosexuals. And homosexuals will never be human until they learn to love Fred Phelps. Do you all know Fred Phelps? His website is godhatesfags.com. And he picketed the funeral of Matthew Shepard in Wyoming with a placard that said, God said fags should die. See Leviticus 20. Well, that's indeed what Leviticus 20 says. You want to read that in church and say, this is the word of the Lord? I don't think so. And before you begin to quote Leviticus to justify your own prejudices, as so many people do today, you better read the rest of the Bible. Maybe you ought to read that passage in Deuteronomy that says, if a child is willfully disobedient and talks back to his or her parents, that child shall be taken to the elders of the city and stoned until dead at the gates of the city. Now, if you take the Bible literally, how many of you would still be alive? Or maybe you ought to read that passage in Leviticus that says, if you commit adultery, you are to be executed. I shall not ask how many of you would still be alive. And if you worship a false god, you are to be executed. Well, who's going to tell you who the true God is? Is it going to be Ian Paisley of Ireland? Or the Ayatollah Khomeini? Or Jerry Falwell? The whole world would be at risk until we agreed on a proper definition of God. And there's a passage in Leviticus that I really only discovered about 2 or 3 years ago when I went through the Bible and got all the things out for which public execution was called for. And I discovered that the book of Leviticus says that if you have sex with your mother-in-law, you are to be executed. I bet you didn't know that was in the Bible. I've never heard that preached on. I think the reason I've never heard it preached on is most people can't imagine it. And you just laugh because you just imagined it. You got to be careful when you begin to claim that somehow God dictated the Bible that includes all of the cultural prejudices of the ancient world. Behind the rising tide of popular God images in the 21st century, there is, I believe, a God experience. And this God experience calls us out to the edges of our humanity, where we experience, sometimes in ecstatic moments, a sense of mystery, a sense of otherness, a sense of transcendence. And we call those experiences God. And then we describe those experiences in terms of our cultural prejudices and predispositions. And that's when the God experience turns demonic. And that's when tribal religion replaces a living, humanizing God. I think that the depth of the Christian story, maybe the depth of every religious story, is summed up in words that are attributed to Jesus in the 10th chapter of St. John's Gospel, where John interprets Jesus' purpose. It was not to get conformity of creed or conformity of religious practice. It was not to go out and compel others to worship the same way you worship or I worship. No, John interprets the purpose of Jesus this way. I have come, he says, that they might have life and that they might have it abundantly. Any religion that diminishes the life of anyone cannot be of God. It becomes part of our tribal passion to survive. God cannot finally be understood as a tribal deity, equipped with supernatural power and living somewhere above the sky and invading the world in miraculous manners, always in the service of those who worship this tribal deity. Prayer cannot be what it so often is, adult letters to a Santa Claus God. Just can't be that. We've got to get beneath that, or the future of our religious tradition is over. I think all of those tribal deities must finally give way to the God who is not known, but who is experienced. The God who is experienced as the source of life that calls each of us to live fully. The God who's experienced as the source of love, who calls each of us to love wastefully. The God who's experienced as the ground of all being, that calls each of us to have the courage to be all that we can possibly be. It's a life-centered, a human-centered God that finally calls us out of our tribal prejudices and out of the worship of our tribal deity. And this God calls us not to be religious. God knows we've got enough religion in this world, and most of it is quite destructive. God's call is to be fully human, to live and to love and to be. And then to try to build a world where everybody has a better opportunity to live fully as a response to the God of life, and to love wastefully as a response to the God of love, and to be what each of us is in the infinite variety of our humanity, whether we are white or black or yellow or green, whether we are male or female, whether we are gay or straight, bisexual or transgender, whether we are left-handed or right-handed, to be all that we can be in the fullness of our humanity. That's what it means to follow the Christ who says, I have come that you might have life and that you might have it abundantly. That is why I am convinced that the present religious revival is not about God at all. It's about fear, and it's about power, and it's about control. And it cannot be the God of the future. Unless this God is finally perceived, this God of the future is finally perceived, I don't think there is any future for the enterprise that we call religion. And if religion has no future, then I think it's fair to say that neither does humanity. For humanity is marked most uniquely by its yearning and its driving out beyond its limits into a full humanity that finally opens into the divinity that marks this universe. I want to see a religious revival that centers in our humanity, that is dedicated to building a more human and humane world. And I think every religion of the world can participate in that kind of humanity. And we should each walk the path of our own cultural religious tradition, but never be limited by that. For the pathway to God always goes beyond the religious systems of men and women the world over. God is not a Christian, or a Jew, or a Muslim, or a Hindu, or a Buddhist. God is that ultimate dimension of life to which each of those systems must point. And we walk through our faith systems, never making an idol out of it. We walk through those faith systems until we escape their limits and enter into the mystery and the wonder of what God is. That's where the future of religion lies. And that's where we've got to bend this nation and our world until this kind of God begins to come into public recognition. Well, thank you very much for your attention.